Today, I'm speaking with Sepehr Achard. Sepehr is the CEO of iGrow News, and he is the proud leader of this innovative media and market research provider in the agriculture technology sector. Sepehr describes himself as having a deep-seated passion for technology and agriculture and is committed to driving insights and providing valuable information to stakeholders in the sector. In a nutshell, that means that iGrow News is essentially providing all the information that you need to understand what's going on in ag tech, vertical farming, and other areas of agriculture. Sepehr's career has been one that started in the finance industry, and he's keen to understand how technology can revolutionize the agricultural industry now that he's moved in as the CEO of iGrow News. Through iGrow News, he is passionate about empowering farmers, agriculture businesses, and technology innovators with accurate, timely, and impactful information and in-depth research. A little bit more about iGrow News. iGrow News is a media company that believes in informing people and sharing unbiased news and analysis regarding ag tech and agri-tech. It's been around since 2021 and is vowed to ensure the accuracy and unbiasedness of the news that is shared so that anyone can find reliable information. So for those of you that are getting your ag tech news off LinkedIn and Facebook, maybe you should check out iGrow News because this is the unbiased source that's there and available for everybody. You can check them out on LinkedIn, and you can check them out at https://igrownews.com. Good. So, Sepehr, great to have you here. Thanks so much for agreeing to talk to us and share with us some of your background and information about iGrow News. So I will have introduced you, of course, so people will know a little bit about the background, and we'll definitely put your website on online, and so people can go and look at it. But for those interested, it's iGrow, so just igrownews.com, like the iPhone. It's a great name. But why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself and about the business, how you got started, so the folks that are listening can learn.
Sure. Thank you very much for this opportunity. So yeah, I'm the current CEO of iGrow News. The story all started back when I was in uni. I just, I've gone through a couple of internships and so on, but wasn't really satisfied with the opportunities that I had. And so one day I had this contact through a blog that was iGrow.news before, and got in contact with the owner, and little by little we just chatted, and we had this idea to create an unbiased news platform for the agri-tech or agri-food tech industry. And since 2021, we're providing, or at least trying to provide, some unbiased news, analysis, and insights in this industry on a global perspective. And yeah, trying to play a role in advancing agri-tech.
Cool. Well, it certainly needs it. And were you interested in the space before you had come in contact with the entrepreneur that started it, or was it just an opportunity that drew your attention?
No, I wasn't absolutely not involved in agriculture. Yeah, I was doing finance before, working in a private equity company, and I got tired of it because at the end of the day, it's just numbers.
Yeah.
So yeah, and this opportunity showed up. I just took my chance, and here we are today.
That's fantastic. And so tell us a little bit more about kind of the structure of your information, how you get it. Do you do research? Do you get it from subscribers? And how do people, what about your business model? I think it's always an interesting thing that to understand how media sites like this work, right?
Yeah, sure. We got the main platform, which is our website, igrownews.com, where we share pretty much all the content that we provide, whether it's interviews with certain entrepreneurs that we've done over the past week, whether it's press releases that we rewrite, whether it's reports that we write ourselves, in which case we do a little bit of research. We get access to some third-party database as well as our own database from sharing the news. Because on the side, we collect data on the industry. Not just in terms of like funding round or in terms of investments made, but more in terms of like business activity, key appointments, what profiles are appointed at which time, of course, the investments, government implications, and data like this that helps us write our own reports. So that's the main part. Then we got like some paid newsletters and free newsletters. The free newsletters are just a daily, 5-minute brief just to get informed of all the latest developments in the industry. And then the paid newsletters is a bit more advanced in it, that we provide a lot more insights, data. We analyze as well certain trends that we've seen throughout the week or throughout the month. And that's done for, so we separated it in different categories. So right now for the paid newsletters, you got the CEA category, so controlled environment agriculture, and you got an AgTech category, which focuses more on like the new technologies involved in soil farming and so on. And so, yeah, that's for the news part. Then there is the market research part, in which case we leverage our own database in addition to some third-party database to provide some custom market research for our clients. So folks come to us wanting to expand in a new market, introduce a new product in the market, invest as well in a new market. And what we provide is all the intelligence that we have and that we can have access to, so that they get all their answers and queries answered. So yeah, that's a bit in a nutshell what we do.
Fantastic. And I see you've also got a job board on here as well. So maybe people that are looking for a job should check you out, right? That's also an important plug, right? And what do you think are some of the challenges that you see in the industry? I mean, I'm really into indoor and vertical farming for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's intriguing. The other thing I think is interesting is that it kind of changes the product category. We do a bit of work as a research company. We do a lot of research around the food product and the taste and things like this. It basically creates a product in a natural grown item, which is very replicable. Even if you have a seed strain that you use in farming, which has been going on for a long time, you still have the variance of the weather, the age of the product when it actually gets to the store and things like this. And it seems like these controlled growing environments really allow to take out a lot of that variability out. But I think, as we've seen in the industry, there are a huge number of challenges to making these businesses work. Or maybe that's just my misunderstanding. I think it could be possible that just the entrepreneurs that started these companies did it in a way that was a little bit capital inefficient, and therefore they didn't really understand the market. So I'm a big believer in this long term, but we've definitely seen a little bit of a dip, particularly in vertical farming. And maybe you could just talk about some of the challenges you see in the industry and what maybe what people are doing differently now than they were 2 years ago. Right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you're spot on. Definitely the drying up of funding has impacted a lot of businesses and a lot of startups that relied on it to develop their business. So that's one of the challenges. And then obviously, I mean, is no different than other industries, but like the hyperinflation, the interest rates as well are impacted to a certain degree the businesses, particularly in the US in terms of interest rates, because over there, I mean, from the relations I have, a lot of the businesses that we work with have had like some variable interest rates loans. And so obviously when you get the interest rate hikes that we've seen over the last 12 to 15 months, it doubles, triples, and sometimes multiplies by 5 your the cost of financing. And so as they deal with very tight margins, it obviously hinders those margins and then impacts the business and makes them unprofitable. In terms of like CEA in particular, you've mentioned that the fact that a lot of those businesses were capital intensive, and that is yeah, that is correct. I mean, what we've seen is that a lot of the businesses that had unproven business models
Mhm.
and that raised millions and millions and hundreds of millions of dollars today are going bust. But there are some companies that raise millions of dollars but had proven business models and scaled those models, in which case it's absolutely not, it's not a big they're not facing a major issue like other businesses are.
Mhm.
The importance here is all about doing your homework, essentially studying the market you're entering in, knowing exactly what you're going to do, knowing exactly who you're going to hire, how many people. And this is particularly relevant in vertical farming, but a lot of businesses have tried to essentially create everything themselves.
Mhm.
So they would essentially hire software engineers to create some software programs, create, hire other engineers, you know, to create themselves the LEDs and so on and so forth, and the HVAC and also all those components. But the reality is that they're just reinventing the wheel.
Mhm.
All those solutions already exist today. There are some companies that have done it for the past 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and they can do it for vertical farming. And that has been the issue. So I would say that because you've mentioned vertical farming, but the two main issues for me is the fact that there is using too much capital when you have unproven business model, and also misusing this. I mean, misusing, not really, I mean, that's a illegal thing, but like not using it in the correct departments and the correct investments that are required for your business. And
Right.
that all is related to knowing your core business. Okay,
Mhm.
do you want to be a grower, or do you want to be a high-tech company?
Mhm.
And a lot of those businesses were in the middle.
Mhm.
They were kind of a grower, but at the same time a high-tech company. And today we're seeing that they're either becoming a grower or becoming a high-tech company.
I see. And so do you think a better model is that growers are basically subcontracting a lot of the tech to, I mean, there's, as you say, there's many of these contractors that have been doing a lot of this kind of tech, even for indoor growing, not just vertical farming, but like, greenhouse growing and things like this for many years. So they're fully optimized, right? Like they're at the right scale. They probably have a good cost and all the rest of this
Mhm.
stuff. So you can, I suspect, buy this technology and this expertise relatively freely on the open market. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are some cases and some components that are where you have just a handful of choices in terms of companies that you could go to. But overall, when you look at it, just it makes more sense to subsidize, to outsource all this innovation to other companies that have been doing it for like 20 or 30 years. Because first of all, you don't have the resources in terms of like the skills and the labor you need, and then it increases your investment and the capital that you need,
Mhm.
and it creates costs that when you're growing something, the more complicated it is, the less likely you're going to be profitable. That's something that I've learned over the last 2 years I've been involved in this business, is that the most successful farms are usually the simplest in terms of like process, in terms of like the costs that they have. You
Mhm.
know, that's something that we've learned.
Yeah, interesting. Probably it's easier to keep track of them. And so do you, looking at something like the plant-based market, right? The plant-based
Mhm.
meat market, where I think now the overall theme is that you can't reproduce a piece of meat. If you can't do that, make just a good product that people want to buy. And I
Mhm.
think there's a little bit of a parallel in something like vertically or indoor grown produce. The question is, like, are people just looking for the same head of lettuce, basil, whatever the crop may be, that is consistent and high quality, which is probably what they would like anyway, no matter where it is grown? Or are they looking for something which is truly different and they want to support that category, or do they not care? Like at the end of the day, either you drive significant cost reduction in any market, or you have a value proposition that is better for the customer. And which one of those things, or both, do you think are being serviced here?
In the plant-based market?
No, in the like vertical farming market, like basically like,
Oh,
because it's a new product, right? It's the same thing that people have eaten for many, many years, decades, hundreds of years, but it's just grown in a different way. So it's got to have some benefit, cost, freshness, etc., that consumers value. And then therefore, what is the consumer proposition, that makes it work, right?
yeah, I mean, that depends then on the location and where you are. In the US, for instance, when you have values like being fresh, locally produced, I mean, even hyper locally produced, highly nutrients, things like this, are values, are components and values that consumers apparently like to see. That's at least what we're hearing. Then in other countries, like in France, for instance, it really depends, because you got some people that would say, yeah, but it's like artificial plants, at the end of the day, it's the same plant. It's just grown in a different environment, but they're saying, yeah, it's not the soil. We're not seeing the dirt. We're not seeing the roots and things like this. So it really depends on where you are and what traditions and beliefs you have about your own fresh produce. You got some countries as well where it's entirely new to have like fresh local produce. I'm thinking about the Middle East, where we've seen a lot of activity regarding vertical farming and indoor farming. Over there 10 or 20 years ago, I mean, I was living there for 15 years. I remember 10 years ago, I mean, it was really rare to see even a head of lettuce produced locally. Usually it would be it would be air freighted from the Netherlands or Spain or sometimes France. And today we're seeing a lot of lettuce, a lot of, small cherry tomatoes. We're seeing small raspberries as well that are produced locally. And that is entirely new. It's a new value proposition that people are not used to see. And in that case, what we're seeing is that people do tend to value the price more than those value proposition, because they're not used to seeing this. It's something entirely new. So there needs to be a little bit of education on the values and all those advantages that it has. But yeah, over there, what we're seeing is that a lot of people look at the price at the end of the day, because again, they're not used to seeing, for them, it's normal to have produce that is shipped or air freighted from another country.
And how does the price compare, like in Dubai, to something that's air freighted in versus being grown?
Well, it really depends on, again, where it comes from, but it can be, last time I've been there, we've seen like locally grown, we've seen some heads of lettuce as much as 5 dirhams, which is the equivalent of 1 or 2 euros, if I'm not mistaken. But imported produce you can have at half the price. It's just because it comes from countries like neighboring countries, like for instance, Iran, where not only does their overheads are far cheaper than locally, but they benefit also from a currency devaluation, because they're paid in dirhams or in dollars, and they have that advantage. So maybe they, they can even retail it at a far cheaper price. So that's, one thing that we've seen. Now, again, I'm going to go there in a couple of weeks again to study it and to see how things changed. But yeah.
And so not quite price parity, but I mean, that's not that much difference. I would imagine that plenty of people can pay another euro or 2 for a head of lettuce if it's local and it is potentially better quality, I suppose, if it doesn't have to travel.
Yeah, but
we'll see.
That's just how. Yeah.
Interesting. Because we've looked at a couple of these cases, like in Singapore And I think like the cost of fresh produce in a place like Singapore is also astronomical. So when you compare that to the end cost to the consumer of doing it, even growing it locally, it starts to make sense in certain markets, whereas in others, you know, I would imagine it's way cheaper to get it from traditional means, right? And then that ultimately is how people make decisions, unless the product quality is significantly different, which I think it probably is not. But yeah, so I definitely can like looking for solving some local problems as the world's population grows. I think that's the interesting piece of it and why it's important to get the business model right in the right place. So hopefully organizations, publications like yourself can help inform even entrepreneurs on where to make good and bad investments, right? Because it doesn't do anybody good, I think, to waste money on getting things wrong. So what do you think about like governmental intervention? I would imagine in the Middle East that this does happen. You know, you see some of these like large planned building developments and things like this. I mean, you know, you have hundreds of thousands of people living in the middle of the desert. You've got to figure out a way to feed them. So I would presume that subsidies could play a big role in getting the industry going as well.
Yeah, I mean, especially because, you know, there's a big difference between government investing and VC investing. The VCs would usually want a return within 7 to 10 years, whereas governments could afford a longer return, which is more adapted to the produce industry or to agriculture, because having a return within 7 years is pretty much close to impossible, unless you're retailing some very expensive spices or things like this, in which case I even think that it's quite tight. But other than this, for normal crops and agriculture in general, I think that subsidies will play a big role, especially in the Middle East. I mean, it is a big government policy and government objective to have a certain food security and to secure certain crops and certain crops by producing it locally. We're seeing it with the UAE, we're seeing it with Qatar, with Saudi Arabia. They all have their respective plan, whether it's by 2030, 2040, 2050. We're seeing that. And we got some local plans, like for instance, the line in Neom, which is that, for those people that do not know what it is this incredible infrastructure that they're building north of the Red Sea, I think. And in which case they want to have like some vertical farms and indoor farms producing local produce, essentially. And so, yeah, I mean, there's a bit, governments over there play a big role in that development. Now, it's not always the case in other countries. Like, for instance, when you look in the US or in certain countries in Europe, it really differs, and sometimes it can be even correlated to the political party of certain governors or certain presidents as well. Like at the moment, we're studying in France whether there's a correlation between the level of technology that is involved in the new innovations in AgTech and CEA, and the political party of the region. And what we're seeing, and we're not finished yet, but we've gone through like nearly a third of the regions in France. What we're seeing is that there is a correlation between the parties and the level of technologies involved. Like right now, what we're seeing is that the more central to left wing the party is, the less techy it is. The more right wing it is, the more technologically and high tech it is. And also the communication that is made around it is very different. We're seeing more sustainable practices, but the mission is to be sustainable within those low tech projects. And we're seeing more communication throughout the profitability issue and the desire to produce more within less smaller areas.
Okay.
So that's,
and what about cases where you have like traditional ag versus technology ag. Like I think there's now this tension, at least I see it in social media, between, you know, sustainable farming and regular, you know, or tech. Like you have like literally there's a few people that I follow or at least come in my feed on LinkedIn that are like anti-tech in ag, right? And they're more about like regenerative agriculture, like traditional methodologies of agriculture. It is very difficult to understand which one works, and probably there's not one size fits all for everything. Do you have any comment or opinions about that tension?
It's an unnecessary tension. I mean, what is amazing is that at the moment, that's the way I see it, is that the agriculture ecosystem, when we think of it, we can picture it as if you had all these continents. So you have the high-tech continent, the regenerative continent, the food tech continent, and they're separated by an ocean of, you know, whatever you want to call it, whether it's ideology, whether it's ego, whether it's stupidity as well in certain cases. And the truth is that you cannot rely on only one system. That is just impossible. It's not like back in the days where the only solution was, you know, to farm on land. Today, you have to have a level of high technology, a level of regenerative agriculture. And at the end of the day, like you said, it all depends on where you are, your market. It all depends on your business model, what you want to produce, whether or not people are also willing to pay, whether it's a premium or willing to buy stuff that is completely new as well. And that's just my thoughts. I think it's really unnecessary to have this debate. And at the end of the day, we're going to need everything and everyone. And I think that there can be some synergies even between CEA or between new technologies and high-tech agriculture and the more, let's say, traditional or low-tech solutions that are brought today.
Right. What about the suppliers into the industry? I'm thinking of like seed producers, fertilizer producers. I mean, some of these are very big companies. Obviously, they have a lot of influence on small farmers. And do you see that there's a responsibility component of what they're doing? And principally, they're probably going to protect their business. And I mean, we've talked to a lot of big seed producers, and many of them are like, yeah, you know, vertical farming is just so tiny. We don't even worry about it, right? Like they're still totally servicing the traditional farmer, which is mostly, you know, falling back on the requirement for yield. Yeah. So like even if they wanted to use, say, for example, regenerative practices, just the whole system, the incentive structure, the fact that they have to make money and basically pay their bills and feed their family, they just fall back on in some years just based on like, I'm going to grow whatever I can have a high yield on, which, you know, it speaks to the incentives in the industry not being aligned towards a final goal. Right. Do you have any comments on that kind of thing? I mean, maybe a pontification about how it might turn out, right? Like how do you resolve that?
I mean, you know, it's one of those questions where you don't really have one answer. It's different answers that could turn out to be the right one. In terms of like how, obviously at the moment, vertical farming is a tiny part of agriculture. But we're seeing some companies and as well some seed producers that do provide certain varieties that are adapted to vertical farming or to indoor farming or to greenhouse as well, greenhouses, which is far more traditional and a far bigger market for them. At the end of the day, it all depends on like whether you want to have one big seed producers or many tiny seed producers that can handle different segments. And, you know, I think that at some point we'll need to ask ourselves whether we want to have a handful of companies controlling the supply of certain produce that are vital, because obviously a farmer without his grains is not going to do anything, you know. And we'll need to ask ourselves whether in a if you want to have like a free market with a lot of competition to have some decent prices and so on, and innovation, you have to ask yourselves whether it's, whether you'll create some smaller companies or that will be able to supply as well some smaller emerging markets like vertical farming or indoor farming.
Right.
But then again, I mean, that's just my opinion. It's not like based on data or based on anything else. It's my opinion.
Yeah, it probably also varies by region as well, right? I mean, I think that's
Yeah.
the thing. It's like such a regional product. It's not like many of these big food brands that we understand that, I mean, they are multinational, even though they might be produced regionally for different markets. It's very, very regional and local product, right? And it probably always will be, right? It always will be because of the way that you don't want to have it travel and things like this. So what's next then for your organization and your publication? Do you have big plans on any changes, or where do you think you're going to play into all this in the long term?
In the long term, I mean, what we're trying to do right now is to just continue to grow what we've created since the beginning of the year, which is all the new segments that we now cover, and food tech, crop science and crop protections and things like this. And then perhaps on the longer term, it would be to create a sort of with the database that we have and with the data that we have, to create a sort of Bloomberg LP of AgTech, where we can showcase in a fancy dashboard all the trends and the data that we have access to. That would be the long-term objective. But on the medium term, it will be to just keep on growing, expand to new markets as well, because right now we're really focusing on North America, Europe, Middle East, but there is also other markets such as Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Latin America as well as the big market, and then hopefully Africa and other countries in Central Asia. But yeah, that's the plan right now.
Are there some regions, it's interesting you mentioned Africa and Central Asia, are there some regions that are just, I don't want to use the word further behind, but they're just using more simple traditional farming techniques? I would presume that in Africa, for example, like cocoa farming is not nearly as mechanized and tech ridden as it is, wheat farming is in the United States. And is that a good thing or bad thing? And how do you think that transition can happen? Because I think protecting that supply chain is something that, a lot of big companies think about, that's for sure.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, obviously it is like, it's not the same everywhere. I mean, there are some countries that are lagging behind. That's just, unfortunately the way it is.
Yeah.
There are some countries where it's really not medieval techniques, but like very old in terms of like it's very labor intensive and things like this. That can be explained by the fact that labor is cheaper than automated equipment. So how this could change, I mean, there are different ways. The way certain of these countries, for instance, in Africa, are growing. We're seeing a couple of investments made. We're seeing World Banks and world organizations as well investing heavily in these countries. That can improve as well the access to certain innovations, and then also the innovation itself in it, that when not when it becomes mainstream, but when it becomes common, usually, I mean, that's would be the economical law, but the prices would go down and would be more affordable. So, but I think that, especially in Africa, I think that we may see a couple of changes within the next decade or two. We're seeing it already in India. We're seeing a heavy automation, and mechanization of agriculture over there.
Mm.
And we're seeing it in certain countries in Africa, mainly in the north and the south, and in countries like Kenya. But yeah, it's really lagging behind. But I think that within the next decade or two, this may change. It will also be liable to certain externalities. Right now, we're seeing a lot of tension as well, geopolitical tension over there that may impact the growth, and that may even create more, more delays in catching up all the innovation that is made around the world. And so, yeah, there are a lot of variables to consider before saying, yeah, within the next 2 decades, it is going to become like what we're seeing in Europe or North America.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned externalities. Like, I think you're referring to some of the coups and other things that took place in Africa and that sub-Saharan region recently. But even things like the war in Ukraine. In our business, we work for a lot of packaged goods companies. I mean, this just completely threw them for a loop because they had to find different formulation changes. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem like that war is going to end immediately. And so, how do you have any experience or comments on how those supply chain disruptions actually play themselves out? Because I mean, it's not like Ukraine is not producing any grain or any seed oil anymore. Maybe it's more difficult to get out of the country, but these economies will still operate to some level throughout all of these disruptions and periods of turmoil. But nevertheless, the world is just still growing, right? And so like people have to find different sources for all of these different types of inputs, and food will get more expensive. Unfortunately, food will get more expensive, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of like within the supply chains, I mean, what I've seen personally is like when you have different sources, usually you're more resilient because if one country, for instance, falls down, like what we're seeing in Ukraine, you can rely on other countries. The problem here, especially in Ukraine, is that can you find the grain at the same price? And that's the problems that we're seeing, is that yes, you can probably find other countries that can produce, but usually it's going to be way more expensive. And so if it is more expensive, then it's just a chain reaction, and what we're seeing with hyperinflation and the inflation on food products. So yeah, I mean, it's a trick. It's really a tricky equation to find, in my opinion, because again, you're liable to a certain weather condition, to a certain environment, because it is agriculture and it is a crop, and you cannot grow it everywhere you want. So at the end, you're just having different suppliers and different options available is definitely a plus. But then comes the economic variable, where you need to find whether you'll be able to find a source that is as cheap or the same price or a little bit more expensive than in this case Ukraine, for instance.
And then when Ukraine does come back, does that disrupt things again, or does Ukraine just be happy that the market price has gone up and they charge the same amount?
Oh, it could be. I mean, that's $1 million question, it could be Ukraine, pricing at the same market price because people are used to that price, and it's a premium for them. Or it could be they want to flood the market again with some cheaper grains, and it would create a shock. But on the other way in it, that a lot of producers will be affected because they won't be able to do the same margins, and they won't be able to supply it at the same price because you got a competitor that can do it way cheaper than you. So it could go either way.
Unfortunately, that creates some also perverse incentives for ending the conflict, which maybe we won't talk about here. But I think
Yeah.
these are all these geopolitical issues that play into these things that I think sometimes the general public doesn't necessarily understand.
But yeah, I mean, I think one interesting thing is that we're seeing that agri-tech and food tech is increasingly being involved in geopolitical tensions.
Mhm.
Like we've seen a couple of months ago, was it the CIA or FBI notes saying that they would recommend protecting the intellectual property of AgTech companies and be careful of certain companies from foreign countries because of intellectual theft.
Mhm.
We're already seeing, I mean, because some of these new technologies obviously use like microchips.
Mhm.
So they're impacted by geopolitical tensions. If you're in fertilizers, it's also part of some geopolitical tensions. So we're seeing a lot of we're seeing AgTech being more and more involved in geopolicies throughout the world.
That makes sense, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's another weapon in the end of the day. If you can feed your population and others cannot, that's a
Yeah.
big bargaining chip. It's a,
Mhm.
I mean, I'm a bit older than you. I grew up in the Cold War, and it was a little bit simpler then, at least about how many nuclear weapons you had. Now it's literally about how much economic power you have, because we're all dependent upon each other. We're almost all trading partners of each other.
Yeah.
I mean, Russia an exception, at least with the West, but I mean, certainly China, forget it. There's no way we're moving away from that relationship. It just will never work.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, there's a tension, and then how does each party kind of exert its force? And then those are great avenues, which I think actually impact real life people more, because they have to buy food every day, right? Whether or not, unfortunately buildings or whatnot are getting blown up halfway around the world. At least I can tell you from being an American, that's important to us, but it is a little bit in one ear and out the other. But when it affects your daily life, that's actually in some way a more powerful weapon, right? Which is an interesting angle, right? It's an interesting thing. Energy, of course, is clear and has been clear for a long time, but food is just another way of funding your economy and economic growth.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Super interesting. Well, on that note, maybe we could draw to a close. Anything else you want to tell us about your publication, or where people can go to see what's going on, or how often you update and things like that, which could be interesting to the listeners?
Yeah, I mean, people can look on our website, igrownews.com. They can follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, where we often post a lot of content on a daily basis. And yeah, they can subscribe as well to our newsletters. They can find all the information on our website, again, igrownews.com. And yeah, that's about it.
Great. Well, we'll be sure to include that in the post. And again, thank you so much. It was great to talk today, and super interesting what you're doing. And yeah, I think it's probably going to require more and more attention from the rest of the world, as we just talked about.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you for what you're doing as well.
Okay, welcome. Thanks very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.